Good afternoon and welcome to this latest edition in the Elephant TV's conversations about developments in the region. And today it's my great pleasure to be joined by Mr. Aly Verjee, who is a political analyst with an expertise in governance, election and transition processes, conflict and security analysis, amongst a host of other issues in this region. He's worked in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. And he lived in Sudan for 7 years until 2011. And he is also a senior advisor at the U.S Institute for Peace and a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute. Aly, welcome very much to the Elephant.
Thank you very much, John.
Aly, the reason we are speaking today, and first of all, I wanted to ask, you're in London right now. Just ask how you're doing, how your family is doing in this COVID lockdown, just to ask after your welfare.
Oh, no, I'm fine, and my family's fine. Thanks for asking. I think we're all struggling with the uncertainty of the situation, but I also think it's important to remember that there are many other issues going on in the world, not only in this country, but around the world. And while COVID is certainly a challenge, it should not distract us or prevent us from paying attention to those other challenges as well.
Great. Well, that brings us to the subject that we are discussing today, which is Sudan. Sudan, as in Khartoum, which is, you lived there for 7 years and you have a deep experience in that country. Just wondering, for somebody who doesn't know very much about Sudan, I was wondering whether you can give us a breakdown of the circumstances that led to the ouster of President Omar el Bashir last year, 2019. He seemed to be a very resilient leader with this partnership with the Islamists. There he seemed very strong, but he was toppled over. So I just wanted to ask just a general question. What are the political, economic and social forces that led to the ouster of such a resilient authoritarian in Sudan?
Well, Sudan and Bashir's Sudan were very much, as you said, long-term features. And Bashir had been in power since 1989 and had seen many, many crises and challenges and survived them all until now, whether it was the early 90s and the isolation that Sudan had from the international community, from harboring terrorists at that time, to the wars with Southern Sudan, which later became an independent country, to Darfur, to the ICC, and so on and so on. If we come to the more recent times, then you can see that after South Sudan's secession from Sudan in 2011, the consequence of that was Sudan's economy was radically changed. And one of the things that had happened over the last 30 years was that the economy had grown substantially, the middle class had also grown substantially. So while Sudan remains a poor country and remains in many places as poor as it might have been 30 years ago, for a lot of people, their standard of living had also increased and improved, and there had been a great deal of urbanization. So cities like Khartoum, but not only Khartoum, had grown substantially. And so you have this urban middle class in a way that you did not have 30 years ago. And I mention that because while people tend to focus on the wars and the conflicts, whether it was in Darfur or in the East or in the South, the fact that you had both this sort of outlying problems in other parts of the country, as well as these challenges at the center, really made it much more difficult for the regime to meet all of these crises. And on top of that, as I said, you had this change in the economic situation. Now, there had been several protests over the last 10 years, in 2013, in 2016, and 2018. And finally, these most recent ones, starting in 2018, really were an existential threat to the regime, because not only could it not manage this discontent that was emerging not only from the most marginalized and oppressed, but also from the middle class, this new middle class that didn't exist before. And on top of that, it could not dispense the patronage that it once had been able to do to remedy or at least address all of the challenges that existed. So it's this combination of factors that made it much more difficult for Bashir to basically manage things. And he tried many different things. He tried to find new alliances externally. He tried to broker new deals. He tried to reshape the economy. But ultimately, after 30 years, it just wasn't possible to make more changes. And the final blow, of course, is that it wasn't just him. It was the fact that his own cohesion inside the regime began to shift and people began to move against him. And that is an important factor in adding to what the people power and the manifestations on the street had been able to do. But until that happened, it still was unclear whether Bashir himself would fall. And so there's a degree of people saving their own necks. There's a degree of recognizing the potential for change and also for opportunism of their own kinds, in addition to the more legitimate grievances that many Sudanese citizens might have had.
The Khartoum, if I'm not mistaken, has a long tradition, longer than even countries like Kenya. Quite a sophisticated middle class, quite a sophisticated intelligentsia in Khartoum that is very well connected, well engaged. And one hears of groups like the Forces for Freedom and Change. And I wanted to ask, what was the role of, ultimately it was a military that moved against El Bashir, but civil society was also very engaged together in the political class. Could you just maybe just give us a perspective on that, and how the structure of urban Sudanese society feeds into some of the political and social changes that made things untenable for Bashir to hang around as head of state?
Well, indeed, there is this history of civil society, academic intelligentsia in Sudan, and if you look at the previous revolutions that occurred in Sudan, both in the 60s and in the 80s, they were certainly important in both of those revolutions as well. And when Bashir came into power and the Bashir regime took office, one of the things that they prioritized over the years was attacking and infiltrating these movements, not only in intelligentsia, but also things like trade unions. And Sudan historically had very strong trade unions in the railways and in agriculture and in some other sectors as well. And that combination of having this sort of educated class and this unionist class was very important in Sudan's politics historically. And a lot of people thought, well, this has basically been crushed, and the regime had managed to infiltrate and really limit their ability to be independent voices. Yeah. But we've seen in this revolution the emergence of what's called the Forces for Freedom of Change. And within that group, the Sudan Professionals Association, which comprises a lot of these professional unions, whether for doctors or for other health professionals or engineers or lawyers, have been very, very important in finding an ability to organize and directing protests and managing to also coordinate. But I think it's important, while people tend to focus on the FFC and the Professionals Association and some of the other groups that comprise the forces, including some of the opposition political parties, the fact is there was a very new dimension to this grassroots mobilization and organization of young people, of women, of people who maybe had not been in the highest ranks of professionals, who aren't necessarily doctors or lawyers or what have you. And so the doctors and lawyers may be amongst them, but there are many others. And that is what tipped the critical mass, so that throughout the country there were so many different protests in so many different places where there were challenges at that time. That combination was really what was important. And today now we see this almost divergence, you could say, between the formal groups that are signatories to the new accord and this new transitional government, and that's supposed to be in place, and they're still there, the Professionals Association, what have you. But because the pace of change for many people has been rather slow, there still have been large protests, popular mobilization on the streets in Khartoum and in other cities as well as problems in some parts of the country, which aren't necessarily directed by elite groups. And so you've got this dimension where there is a popular desire for change and for things to move, and sometimes that's in coordination with the leading prominent lights of the opposition groups, which are now trying to be the civilian part of government, and sometimes it's not. Okay.
You mentioned the slow pace of change, and I just wanted to ask, obviously Bashir took power as a military dictator through a coup. The military remains very influential in Sudan, and with the new transitional government of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, I mean, there was an assassination attempt against him just this last March, and one sees the use of language that we are also witnessing here in Kenya and other African countries of a deep state that is comprised of the military, the intelligence services, and that these remain extremely influential in Sudan. And I was wondering whether you can just give me sort of a layout of this so-called deep state that remains quite influential. We have reading up and hearing of General Badala, I think it's Bafala, who's head of the General Intelligence Security Directorate, and that's come under the Ministry of Interior, and all these changes that have taken place that seem to be very much internal, orchestrated changes within an elite that was around Bashir, that is removed from the aspirations and of the people who are demonstrating on the streets, and also perhaps seems slightly removed from the Prime Minister and sort of the reformers around him. I just wanted to get your take on that, and also where the Islamists, I've heard of large purges of Islamists from the military and police and that kind of thing. Where have they gone? They've always been quite influential, at least during the term of Bashir.
Well, yes, a lot of different aspects there, but maybe I can start by saying that when any new regime comes into power, there is always this great aspiration of things are going to be different, and optimism that's there. And to some extent, old presidents or old leaders are symbols as well as practical demonstrations of what people see as having gone wrong in their country. And as you said, it's not unique to Sudan, and certainly if we think of any time a new administration comes into power, there are all of these hopes that surround it. And for Abdullah Hamdok as Prime Minister of Sudan and his cabinet, the same is true, but they are coming up against some very difficult structural realities, both present from this new arrangements that have been put in place. So as a result of the new dispensation, the military still has a very significant role, in some senses even an even more enhanced role, as well as the older, more historical reasons for there to be difficulties in Sudan. And so there are new figures in the ministries, and all of the Bashir loyalists that were in the cabinet and in the senior positions in many areas have either been removed or put aside in some way, and some of them are under arrest, some of them are staying quietly at home, some of them are outside the country now. But that doesn't necessarily change at all levels, and it's very difficult to completely reform bureaucracy. But also, I think it's very difficult to reform the patterns of that bureaucracy. And that's even when there is goodwill, let alone when we talk about things that you mentioned, such as the intelligence service. So the intelligence service for many years played an outsized role, far beyond intelligence gathering, which is what it was supposed to do under the constitution. It was effectively a state of itself. It had a military unit, it had the control of many businesses, it took up a lot of money from the state, but also it controlled a lot of private activity. And so you had this tension between the intelligence service and the army and some of the other military groups there. And this was intentional to some extent. This is something that Bashir could then use to make sure that no force grew too powerful, but also that they served different interests each other to some extent, and make sure that he could manage this. And so that delicate balance has now changed, because not only is Bashir not there, and there are new people that have come to the fore, such as Hemeti, who has played a significant role in what's called the Rapid Support Forces, which are effectively a state actor, but also were outside the state, and so play this sort of dual role. The intelligence service, which, yes, you mentioned, is now under new leadership, in the sense that Bashir's Director General of the Intelligence Service is no longer there, but it still has this very powerful outsized role in the economy, in the society. It's a difficult thing to reform. And the military, which has been so embedded, but also now has this role in the transition, and is in some sense the de facto decision maker in many of the transitional decisions, despite the fact that there is a civilian cabinet as well. So under all of these circumstances, it's no surprise that there has been slow progress in some areas, and in fact even reversals in some areas, or some commitments unfulfilled. For example, there's still no transitional parliament, so everything is being done by the executive, and certainly having a parliament wouldn't solve all problems, but it does mean that to the extent that other voices can be brought into the conversation in an elite way, in a representative way, but in an elite institution, those are being excluded, and so it's even more narrowly representative than it might otherwise be.
You mentioned the Rapid Support Forces led by Hemeti, is Mohammed Dagalo, and if I'm not mistaken, this is the group that included forces. It's a militia, isn't it? And it includes groups like the Janjaweed. We know everyone has heard of the Janjaweed and the atrocities in Darfur. Can you perhaps just throw a bit of light into? It's quite a unique kind of formation, isn't it? Because it's not part of the military. It's not part of any sort of organized. It's not part of any constitutional organ of the Sudanese government, but seem to wield quite a lot of military power within Sudan under Bashir. What is it, and how did it come together, and how is it deployed?
Well, it is now a legal entity, but you're right to talk about this sort of somewhat confusing past. And in some ways, the best way to think about it is the name RSF is a rebranding. It's not a new thing. It is a rebranding of something that was more unpalatably called. And once you name something and you give it an insignia and whatever, it becomes somewhat more official, even if the reality is slightly less organized, slightly more complicated. But yes, the origins of this are as a militia, and some of the people involved in that militia historically were involved in the conflict in Darfur. It's important, though, to note that there's also been a lot of turnover in the RSF, in the sense that people who were fighting in 2003 or 2004, 15, 16, 17 years ago, may not necessarily be the members today. And I think that's important too, to see this as something which can originate in some areas of Darfur, but isn't necessarily exclusively tied to this conflict. And one of the biggest areas where the RSF expanded in recent years, which I think is important to know, and people don't always remember this, is in the war in Yemen. And so the Sudanese deployment to Yemen, yes, the Sudanese army was also part of that, but it was also the Rapid Support Forces that went to Yemen and were fighting on the side of the Saudi Emirati coalition. And so this provided both money because the Saudis and Emiratis were willing to pay, and they would rather have Sudanese die than have their own citizens die. And secondly, it provided combat experience in what has also been a very brutal conflict. And so you have these people returning to Sudan, to Darfur, but also other parts of Sudan in large numbers, and in numbers which are much more, let's say, acclimatized to this internationalization of conflict in a way that, yes, Darfur was also a terrible conflict, but the RSF or its predecessors were not being paid millions and millions by the Saudis or Emiratis to prosecute that conflict. And I don't want to be too superficial about it, but I think these things matter about rising aspirations. And so Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, which is a sort of nickname for him, was the commander, or is the commander of this force. And at a certain point, it was officially integrated into the Sudanese military structure. So at least on paper, it has a legal incorporation. But the reality is it has operated and continues to operate as a largely parallel force. And so one of the decisive aspects of what happened in Khartoum in terms of the revolution was when the RSF and when Hemeti decided, I'm no longer going to back Bashir. And so if he hadn't made that decision, then Bashir certainly could have survived, probably would have survived a bit longer, not necessarily forever, but it was that moment that certainly changed the course of events. And so that has elevated Hemeti, and he is now the deputy chair of the Sovereign Council. So effectively you have this civilian authority and you have this military authority, and the Sovereign Council is comprised of both civilian and military, and is led by a Sudanese general, General Burhan, and Hemeti is the number 2 in that. So this is separate from the civilian cabinet. But regardless of the titles, it's clear that Hemeti now has a very large role in national politics. And previously his role was not national, it was more confined to his concerns in Darfur, a little bit in South Kordofan, and of course, what I was talking about with the war in Yemen. And so the revolution has elevated Hemeti, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as far as the revolutionaries themselves go. And Hemeti is now in this very powerful position to basically say yes or no. And a good example of what's been going on now is during the coronavirus pandemic in Sudan, where there have been restrictions, like in Kenya, there have been restrictions in Sudan, and people have been limited from moving from their homes for certain periods of time. Hemeti and the RSF were distributing aid, food packages that were branded with RSF colors and insignia, and saying this wheat or this grain, whatever they were distributing, is coming from us. Look how generous we are. And the reality is that's all money that was either looted from the Sudanese state or gained from the conflict in Yemen, but is presented as charity to the Sudanese people. And that just demonstrates, once you give people food, they're not going to question who paid for it and where it came from, right? That if you're hungry, you take it. And so this is just an indication of that sort of campaign that he's on to present himself as an acceptable part of the new political arrangements in Sudan.
Ali, if you were to give me 10 names of key figures in Sudan that are important at this moment of tremendous transition. And you've mentioned some, like Hemeti, the Prime Minister, the commander of the military. Who are some of the others that those of us who are in the region on the outside looking at watching events in Sudan, who are some of the other people that we should just keep an eye on, whether they be both progressive or reactionary or just status quo? Who are key players in the Sudanese evolving situation?
Well, I think yes, we mentioned a few of them, like Hemeti and Burhan from the military side of the Sovereign Council, and then you have more civilian figures in the the transitional cabinet and the civilian side of things. I think, though, I would just mention some names that are important but aren't necessarily thought about in political terms, who are business figures. And so you have people like Osama Dawood, who controls the biggest business conglomerate in Sudan, the Dow Group. And there are other people in the business community who are pretty low profile, considering the amount of money and control they have. They're not ostentatious and flashy necessarily, but their role is pretty important, especially as Sudan is going through this economic crisis.
Yes.
And so their role, both in the revolution, was important because some business people backed the revolutionary groups in terms of saying, well, we'll support you to the extent that we can. And historically, that hadn't happened in recent times. But also, of course, as we know, a lot of business people are quite conservative and they want to protect their interests. They want to protect their business opportunities and so on. And so I think those people don't get a lot of attention, but they're important to recognize. And they're big industries when it comes to the export of gold, for example, which goes to which leaves the country and is now Sudan's biggest revenue earner after the decline of oil. So the people that control the gold sector are also some in government and some outside, and Hemeti again is involved in some of that work. And I think the other thing we need to consider, the other types of people we need to remember, are some of and this goes to an earlier question that you raised about what happened to the Islamists, are some of those Islamist figures other than Bashir. Yes. So ex-NCP or NCP, National Congress Party figures like Ali Osman Taha, former vice president, like Nafi Ali Nafi, that these people are in some sense counted out, that their time has passed and they're now either facing charges or they've been removed from the scene. But they're still there. I mean, I think they have credibility amongst their constituencies in a way that others may not, but also in a way they can sit back and wait, because if this regime fails, if this new administration fails, the transitional government fails, it's going to fail on economic grounds. It's going to fail because they don't have enough money. And that means, if it does fail, that means that the military is going to be more powerful, but it also means there's also a chance for these former regime officials who aren't Bashir, who don't necessarily have Bashir's baggage, to see a new role for themselves, perhaps in the Sudan to come. I mean, it's difficult to say exactly, but I think we should not forget these people as well.
Thanks. If Ali, if I just segue a little bit into what, I mean, I just wanted to ask, what would you consider to be the main sort of democratic milestones that have been achieved since Bashir left, and what is anticipated? I mean, one, of course, we saw the removal of Bashir. He's been charged. He's actually been sentenced for corruption, and now there's another case that he's facing. A peace commission has been set up. There is this purge of the Islamists from the security services, etc. What are some of the other, we say, democratic milestones of what Sudan is trying to achieve? Small things like, for example, freedom of the media, freedom of association, people's ability just to use smartphones to exchange information, that kind of thing. What are some of the some of the milestones that would be interesting to look at that have already happened, and some of those that are anticipated by the current transitional administration?
I think the answer to that depends very much on where you are in the country, okay. Because the reality is that people's experience in Khartoum, in the center of Khartoum, is quite different even from people who live on the outskirts of the city in poorer areas, and again is different from people who might be living in East Sudan or West Sudan. Yes. Or in other more rural parts of the country. And so I only add that because I think that when people talk about milestones that have been achieved, the things that are typically pointed to are the establishment of these new institutions and some legislative reforms that have occurred, which I don't want to discount. These are important things, and the new Minister of Justice has done a sterling job of trying to change things and repeal some of the restrictions on women's rights, for example, and some of the public order things which are essential in terms of guaranteeing basic rights like freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression has improved too. But if you are in Darfur today, in certain parts of Darfur, if you're in even the outskirts of Khartoum, you may not see, or you may not feel that reform has really reached you. And so I think one has to caveat these milestones by saying that their implementation has been inequitable so far. It's been uneven, and that isn't necessarily the sole responsibility of the central government. That's part of the reality of the unfolding of some of these challenges, but it's also the expectation, perhaps, that in a place like Darfur, where the military and the other armed actors are still very much in control, that the change of certain laws that allow greater freedoms may not be relevant when the military basically calls the shots or is responding to insecurity as they see it in certain parts of that region. What's anticipated? Well, there's a lot of reform required by the agreement that's been put into place, and I think that spans social, economic, and political changes. I think that the question is how many of these things will happen, because like many agreements, the schedule is behind where it ought to be. Time is always challenged. There are conflicting priorities. The establishment of institutions is in some sense easier than getting them to function. As you know, it can be a challenge to establish them, but it's also a greater challenge for them to be effective and to deliver something. And so that's going to be part of the issue too. And then fundamentally, economic reform, and by economic reform, I mean getting a control on the state's budgets, because until now, most of the state's budget, most of the state's formal budget has been going into the security sector in one form or another. And that's clearly unsustainable, but it also means that there is nothing left for anything else. And whether we can argue about what the priorities of any government should be, but if all of its money or all of its resources are going to feed the security sector, then the argument about other priorities is almost irrelevant. And that's not even considering all of the off-budget expenditures that have happened over the years. So this is, I think, one of the greatest legacies that this transitional government could achieve. Abdullah Hamdok is a world-renowned economist. He was the head of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. And there are other economists in the cabinet that they really need to get a handle on that, and they have the power to do so now. But the Sudanese are hoping and waiting for that change to come.
Ali, I mean, you mentioned earlier the involvement of Sudanese troops and militia in the war in Yemen, and one of the unique things about the Sudanese situation has been this sort of very heavy involvement by regional and international actors in that whole situation. Whether you're talking about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, Turkey, Iran, Qatar, the U.S., etc. One hears of conversations happening with Israel even. And I just wanted you just to sort of give a bit of the lay of the land in terms of who are these actors, what is their roles. Some of them aren't sort of the paragons of democratic sort of example development in the world, and yet one gets a sense that they are quite involved in what's happening in Sudan. And I just wanted to get your take on the extent to which that influence is positive, negative, or neutral of these different factors.
Yes, it depends is the answer. And indeed, every point of the compass, there is a slightly different story to tell. And Sudan, of course, once being the largest country in Africa with almost as many neighbors as any other country, slightly smaller these days, but still, if we start from the West, The Sudan-Chad relations have always been axiomatic to what's going on in Eastern Chad and what's going on in Western Sudan. And Western Sudan, of course, is Darfur. And so today, the situation has changed again because now you have a new government in Khartoum and an existing government in N'Djamena under Idris Deby, who's also been there for a very long period of time and has faced many of his own challenges. And so his primary concern is ensuring that there isn't any movement to remove him or challenge him. And historically, those have come across the border from Sudan. And so that is always the driving thing. And when there's a new regime in town, those existing assumptions become questioned. And so Deby, his future is also uncertain, but he's a survivor too. And so the relations there are very much seen through that lens. And of course, Darfur is Hemeti's backyard, so to speak, as well. And so this is also why it's important to consider the relations between Chad and Sudan. Moving north, you have Sudan Libya, and Sudan's Libya border is not huge, but Sudan's involvement in Libya and Libya's involvement in Sudan over the years has also been there. And of course, Libya, being in its own form of chaos, has had Sudanese mercenaries over the years involved after the fall of Gaddafi. Today, of course, the situation in Libya is also still quite complicated in its own way, and there isn't that same involvement of Sudanese officially in Libya, but clearly there are interests there, and this question of broader stability matters across both sides of that relationship. Turning to Egypt, Egypt and Sudan had been under Bashir having somewhat strained relations, not entirely seeing eye to eye in all things, and the best recent example of this was that over the last few years under Bashir, Sudan had taken Ethiopia's position on the Grand Renaissance Dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, after Bashir, Sudan's position is somewhat more back in the middle, let's say, that on some things it's agreed with Ethiopia and some things it's agreed with Egypt. But it just is indicative, that change was indicative, because for so many years, Sudan was this reliable, taken for granted, so to speak, by the Egyptians, that of course Sudan would have our interests at heart and would never cross us. And it came to pass since the 90s that couldn't always be taken for granted. And so with Bashir's departure, Sudan-Egypt relations again are changing. Of course, Egypt being led by a military figure in his own right has an affinity for military figures. And so that increasing relationship between more recently arrived military figures in power in Sudan and let's say the more established regime now in Egypt is also important and provides a counterweight for the Sudanese military against its own domestic challenges with the Sudanese civilians because of their, let's say, better relationship with the Egyptian military, better than what the Sudanese civilians could ever have with the Egyptian military, for example. Then, yes, you have the whole Gulf, Red Sea region from Saudi Arabia to Emirates to Qatar to Iran. Over the last 10 years, at some point, Sudan had good relations, or relatively good relations with Iran, and moved away from Iran at a certain point and moved back towards the Saudi Emirati axis. Also had good relations with Qatar, but that's being challenged by the fallout, the disputes that the Qataris have with their neighbors, and Qatar historically being more sympathetic to a more Islamist regime, whereas the Saudis and Emiratis were more happy with a less Islamist regime and perhaps a more authoritarian, stronger force, which is now, again, what we have. And then that lines up with the Egyptian position. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis back the Egyptian military regime in Cairo over what was there as a more civilian but Islamist government previously. And so there's all this question of who has ability to curry favor and influence events in Sudan, and Sudan being a relatively large country and a rich country in its resources, but poor in financial terms, has always been susceptible to this influence. And then, of course, there's a very large Sudanese diaspora the Gulf as well. Coming round to Ethiopia then, as I've mentioned already, the questions over the Nile River waters, but also Ethiopia going through its own transition and having played a very important role in the Sudanese arrangements, the transitional arrangements, and played a key role in brokering them. The Ethiopia-Sudan relations are very important to the broader stability of the Horn, and you know, it's unclear how both transitions are going to go in both countries. But as we know, incumbents are usually in a stronger position, and so this is also part of what will continue to be the case, that Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia will be called on when there is a crisis in Sudan to intervene and to play this regional stabilization role. And then I think that the most important country that I haven't mentioned is South Sudan, because South Sudanese relations are always complicated because of land, because of water, because of oil, because of the shared history, because of migration of Sudanese and South Sudanese across that border, and the long complications that have derived from Sudan's troubled history as one country, now two countries. And so oil, while not the most important revenue earner for Sudan today, is still very important, and South Sudan's oil still goes through Sudan. There's no export apart from the pipeline that flows north. The other relations in terms of conflict and backing the armed forces or the armed groups on the other side of the border has historically been an issue as well. And today, South Sudan finds itself in this mediating role in terms of the conflict in Sudan, has been hosting peace talks for the non-signatories to the current transitional arrangements in Sudan have gone to South Sudan to have talks with the new Sudanese government. And so you have this very strange sort of arrangement. And at the same time, of course, South Sudan has its own very severe challenges in terms of its own political trajectory and coming out of conflict as well. And the Sudanese, by necessity, are implicated and are interested in what goes on in South Sudan and in the stability and peace that is found or not found in South Sudan as a whole. So there's a lot within the region that adds and contributes to the situation in Sudan. And then, of course, I would say that whether it's Uganda, especially, or Kenya, there are also East African interests. And take Uganda, and Museveni and Bashir were contemporaries, effectively, and backed for a long time the opposition of their adversary. So Museveni was backing anti-Bashir forces and Bashir was backing anti-Museveni forces. Of course, that's changed today, no longer Bashir and no longer a direct boundary with Sudan and Uganda, because South Sudan is in the middle now. But when it comes to, for example, having influence in South Sudan, there is an ongoing struggle there, not only now, but for many years to come, over who has greater influence. Does Museveni's Uganda have greater influence over what goes on in Juba, and particularly in the presidential palace in Juba, or will it be Khartoum? And historically, it's been a contest between those two, and Khartoum now in a weaker position, but looking longer term, I'm sure that will continue to be an issue. And when interests conflict or seem to conflict, then of course there are challenges to how those things are resolved and mediated or not resolved.
Ali, just thank you. One final question. Just you've been following. You've lived in Sudan. You've been following it closely for a long period of time. Just very briefly, what do you say are its prospects? I know you've mentioned specifically that the economy may define many things, but if you look at the next 18 to 24 months, what are Sudan's prospects, given everything that's happening within Sudan and also around all these neighbors who it's a huge country. Whenever I'm flying from out of Kenya into Europe, I just have to keep on reminding myself, most of the time I'm flying over a Sudan, either South Sudan. So most of that flight is just over one country. What are the prospects?
Indeed. Well, I would just single out three things. First is the economy. If the Sudanese government can't get a handle on inflation, on public expenditure, on food prices for your average person, then they're going to be in serious trouble. And these are the things that really matter to people, and they just encourage greater capital flight. If you're already limited income is devaluing by the day, you want to preserve as much of it as possible by converting it to hard currency or trying to get it outside the country, if you have any excess at all, if it isn't all spent on basic survival. So that's a key aspect, and if that will determine the next year. The second aspect, I would say, is this ongoing struggle between the military and civilian components of the transition. That there may be a crisis, whether it's something like the assassination attempt that you mentioned earlier, or something immediate like that, or something which is perhaps more structural in terms of testing the resilience of the transitional arrangements, which tips the balance decisively. And the risk is it tips decisively in favor of the military. And so the civilian aspects of the transitional arrangements really needs to shore itself up to ensure that does not occur. And then thirdly, I think, is the international dimension to this, that Sudan is crushed by debt. It's crushed by this long-standing reputation of being either a terrorist harboring state or being a bad actor. And whether that is true today or not, and I don't think it's true today, even with the military actors where they are, it is going to be decisive in determining what sort of Sudan exists in future, whether Sudan continues to struggle on or can find a more reasonable landing for its people, and to encourage greater stability, but also greater hope for many people. And that's what they're looking for. And if there isn't sufficient international support for the transition, then we know what will happen. It will revert to a more predatory type of state and a more predatory type of country, which won't be good for its neighbors or for the wider international community.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Aly Verjee, for speaking to The Elephant today. That was a really comprehensive overview of a huge country in which there are many moving pieces economically, politically, and socially at the same time. So I'd like to say that it would be really nice to be able to catch up with you again after some time has passed, just because things seem to be moving quite quickly, not only in Sudan but in the region. But I just wanted to say thank you very much for this chat today with The Elephant.
Thank you, John, and I'm happy to be here, and thanks to all your watchers and viewers.
Thank you.